family deserves answers, and our community deserves answers. I understand the public's urgency to know what happened to Nolan, but we are not taking time for time's sake. We are taking the time required to complete the work this investigation demands.
My concern, and also my husband's concern, was it was not even an hour that his body had been removed, and the sheriff came out and said, this is, accidental drowning. We don't think there's...
2 autopsies, 3 weeks, 0 public agreement on how an 18-year-old ended up dead in the water off the Mississippi coast. Nolan Wells' family paid for an independent exam because they didn't trust the version they were first given. A drowning, announced almost before anyone had time to ask a follow-up question. What came back wasn't the answer anyone wanted. Undetermined. Not ruled an accident. Not ruled anything else either, because the pathologist says the exact evidence that could settle it one way or the other simply wasn't available to examine. Meanwhile, the district attorney who will eventually decide whether any of this goes in front of a grand jury used her only public statement this week to ask her own community for one thing: patience. Not new information, not a timeline. Patience. From a family that's already 3 weeks into wondering what actually happened to their son, on what started as nothing more than a 4th of July boat trip with friends. Nobody's answered that yet. That's the whole reason this story is still going. Nolan Xavier Wells was born on August 19, 2007, and lived his whole life in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, the kind of small Gulf Coast town where everybody who ever watched him play football on a Friday night still remembers exactly how that felt. He graduated Ocean Springs High School in 2025, a multi-sport athlete who'd already made the kind of impression that outlasts a season. His football coach, Jake Bramlett, put it plainly after Nolan died. He was so much more than an outstanding player. He carried himself with humility, treated people with respect, and led by the way he worked, not the way he talked about it. That reputation followed him well past his own graduating class. A teammate a couple of years behind him said being around Nolan made the people near him want to be better, that if he saw someone having a bad day, he'd go out of his way to pick them up. Even players who'd already moved on remembered him the same way. A former Ocean Springs player, who went on to play safety at Alabama, called Nolan a great teammate, but an even greater person. His principal described him as a remarkable student and an even more remarkable brother, on top of everything he was in a classroom. He was raised Catholic, baptized as a boy at St. Joseph in Moss Point, and he kept worshiping there and at St. Elizabeth Seton in Ocean Springs all the way up until the summer he died. By July of 2026, Nolan had enrolled at Southwest Mississippi Community College on a football scholarship. 6'1", 185 pounds, a wide receiver getting ready for his freshman season, planning to major in business. Summer workouts had already started. He was due back on campus the Monday after the 4th of July. His mother, Christine, would later say he had a gentle, calming spirit about him, that he had a way of making people feel seen and welcome, that he could lift somebody's confidence with just a few words and make them feel like they belonged. He told his family he hoped to have 3 daughters of his own one day. A few days before the holiday, he cooked dinner for his parents after his mother got home from work. Neither of them knew it would be the last time they saw him in person. None of that made the news, not at first. What made the news is what happened after, and it started the way it does for a lot of families on the Mississippi coast every summer, with a boat and a holiday. On the morning of July 4th, Nolan climbed onto a boat at a private dock in Ocean Springs, a little before 10. It wasn't a spontaneous decision or a first-time risk. This was a trip he and his friends had made before, a Horn Island run they knew well, headed out to celebrate the holiday the way a lot of families along the Mississippi coast do every summer. His best friend, Javon Williams, was supposed to ride out with him, but that boat was already full, so Javon caught a different one and met up with Nolan once they'd both landed. By 11:14 that morning, according to GPS data later pulled from the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, the boat carrying Nolan had reached the island. Horn Island isn't a quiet stretch of sand most of the year. It's federally protected, uninhabited, with no shelters, no restrooms, no cell service. But on the 4th of July, it fills up with holiday boaters from every direction. Sometimes hundreds or thousands of people anchored along the same shoreline. That's the scene Nolan and his friends walked into. A packed, chaotic beach party stretched across a barrier island most of them had visited a dozen times before. Somewhere around 3 o'clock that afternoon, the accounts of what happened next stopped lining up. One friend, Warren Hudson, says that's the last time he personally saw Nolan, as the group started getting ready to head back. A young woman Nolan had met on the island that day tells a different story. She says Nolan told her he was getting on the boat with his friends. His friends say Nolan told them the opposite, that he was staying behind to spend more time with her. Those two accounts can't both be true. Ben Crump, the family's attorney, put it about as plainly as it can be put. Somebody isn't telling the truth. About an hour later, the boat that had carried Nolan out that morning started taking on water. Emergency dispatch audio, later obtained by NBC News, captures the panic in real time. A bilge pump failure, a distress call placed around 4 o'clock. Hudson has said that in the scramble to get everyone off a sinking boat, he told Nolan to get on board. According to GPS records, the boat left Horn Island at 4:31 p.m. Nolan wasn't on it. His family didn't learn any of this until much later that night. Around 11 p.m., one of Nolan's friends called his mother Christine to tell her Nolan was missing. She began posting on social media before sunrise the next morning, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department launched a search alongside the Coast Guard, the National Park Service, and volunteers from the United Cajun Navy, who say they responded directly to Christine's call for help. For nearly 2 full days, there was nothing. Then, on the morning of July 6th, a National Park Service ranger found Nolan's body in the water off the island's northwestern shore. There's one more detail about that day that didn't make it into most early coverage, and it's not a small one. In photos from the boat, Nolan, 6'1", unmistakable in a crowd, is the only black person in his group of friends. That fact alone proves nothing about what happened to him. But combined with Mississippi's own history, and with a cause of death nobody can yet explain, it's a large part of why this stopped being a regional story about a missing teenager and became a national one within days. The Jackson County Sheriff's Department found Nolan's body on the morning of July 6th. That same day, before any autopsy had been performed, Sheriff John Ledbetter's office told the public that no foul play was suspected. To the family, that timing alone was the problem. Christine has said she respects law enforcement, but that the rush to call it an accidental drowning made both her and Nolan's father deeply uncomfortable. Why, she asked publicly, were investigators so quick to land there? What she and Elmore wanted, she said, was simply transparency. Part of what made that statement hard to accept was the specific story attached to it. Investigators said their early interviews indicated Nolan chose to stay behind on the island, planning to catch a ride back with someone else. Elmore Wansley didn't recognize his son in that account. "We always taught him," he said, "if you go with a group, you stay with the group." Nolan's best friend, Javon Williams, said much the same thing in his own words. He'd never known Nolan to let his friends leave without him. "If you rode out with Nolan," Javon said, "he was going to ride back with you too." To be fair to the Sheriff's Department, there's a more measured read on all of this. A department spokesperson later suggested no foul play was suspected, may simply have been a poor choice of words that got misread as a conclusion instead of what it actually was, an early, working assessment. Ledbetter has said consistently that his office moved quickly, that the 3 friends who'd been on the boat with Nolan were interviewed in depth, and that the FBI came in to help examine digital evidence. By later in July, that witness list had grown past 60 people. The county coroner, for his part, said the body was sent to the state medical examiner's office specifically because of the condition it was found in, and specifically to determine whether trauma or foul play was involved, which suggests the official process was taking that question seriously, even if one early public comment didn't sound like it. None of that was enough to hold the family's trust. Within days, they'd hired Ben Crump, one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the country, and the Reverend Al Sharpton joined him publicly not long after. Sharpton was direct about why. "The reason that a lot of people across the nation are looking at this Nolan situation is because we're looking at the history in Mississippi," he said. "We can't have someone in law enforcement saying there was no foul play before there was an investigation." That framing didn't sit well with everyone. Mississippi's governor and a state senator both came to the sheriff's defense publicly, calling the criticism unfair and saying they had full confidence in an investigation that hadn't, at that point, turned up any actual evidence pointing anywhere else. Both things were true at once. A family that felt dismissed, and a sheriff's office that maintained, under real pressure, that it hadn't found anything to contradict its own account. What the family did next was as concrete as their patience had become thin. They had Nolan's body flown from Mississippi to Washington, D.C., specifically so it could be examined by a doctor with no ties to Mississippi law enforcement at all. "It is not adding up," Crump said, explaining the decision. Whatever that independent exam found, it wasn't going to come from anyone connected to the investigators the family had already stopped trusting. That decision, put a body on a plane rather than wait, is the moment this stopped being purely a local story and became a fight over who gets to be believed. The independent autopsy Nolan's family paid for happened on July 10th, 6 days after he disappeared, performed by Dr. Roger Mitchell, a board-certified forensic pathologist and the president of the National Medical Association. It didn't include a toxicology screening that takes longer, and wasn't part of what this exam was built to answer. What it was built to answer was simpler and harder at the same time. Does anything about this body contradict a straightforward drowning? Some of what it found actually cuts against the darkest theories. There were no lacerations, no skull fractures, nothing that points to an obvious, violent injury. What it did find was a patch of red discoloration in the soft tissue at the back of Nolan's head. And here, even the experts don't agree on what that means. An outside forensic pathologist, who wasn't involved in the case, brought in only to give a neutral read, put it about as honestly as it can be put. That kind of discoloration could reflect ordinary changes from decomposition, or it could reflect blunt force trauma to the head and neck. Both are real possibilities. Neither is confirmed. Then there's the detail that's dominated the headlines. The structures inside the throat that a pathologist checks specifically to rule out strangulation. The trachea, the larynx, the thyroid cartilage, the hyoid bone, weren't there for Dr. Mitchell to examine. That's not nothing. The hyoid bone in particular is notoriously fragile, and forensic pathologists rely on it heavily in exactly these situations, because a fracture there is one of the clearest physical signs that pressure was applied to someone's throat while they were still alive. Without it, and without the surrounding tissue, that entire category of evidence simply isn't available to check. Not confirmed, not ruled out, just absent from this specific exam. Nobody investigating this case has said publicly why. What can be said honestly is that this leaves a real, documented gap in the one exam the family trusted enough to commission. And that gap is exactly why Mitchell's own report stopped short of ruling anything out. None of that means something happened to Nolan's throat. It means the evidence that could answer the question one way or the other wasn't in front of the one doctor examining it without any tie to Mississippi law enforcement. And there's a case to be made that none of this needs a darker explanation at all. The coroner, who's handled cases on these islands for years, says the currents on the western side of Horn Island are known for pulling people under fast, strong swimmers included, and that his office has taken in drowning victims from Mississippi's barrier islands more times than he can easily count. Mitchell's own report makes a version of the same point in more careful language. When someone who's a strong swimmer is found dead in water, the first job is figuring out exactly how they entered it, which is a real forensic question, not an accusation. What's still missing from all of this is the exam that actually carries the state's authority. The Mississippi State Medical Examiner's Office performed its own autopsy on July 7th, the day after Nolan's body was found. Nearly 3 weeks later, as of this recording, none of those results have been made public. That's the gap the family's independent exam was trying to fill in the meantime, and it's the gap that's still open now. 2 days ago, this case took its sharpest turn yet, and it's not in your source material because it's that recent. At a press conference, Ben Crump made his most direct accusation so far, that investigators would have handled this case differently if the races had been reversed, if Nolan had been white and the friends who returned without him had been black. He also questioned whether the state medical examiner had fully disclosed everything collected during the initial autopsy. District Attorney Angel Myers-McElrath answered him directly in a video statement released the same week. She rejected the idea that bias had shaped the investigation, said her office remains focused on evidence rather than speculation, and confirmed something that hadn't been clear before, The official state autopsy, completed back on July 7th, will not be released to the public at all. It's being held for a grand jury instead. Every death in the county, except those of natural causes and non-criminal car wrecks, is presented to your grand jury, she said. Many people don't know that. We have handled death investigations in this manner my entire career. Whatever it says, the public doesn't get to see it before that process runs its course. Not because of this case specifically, McElrath maintains, but because that's how it's always worked in her office. This didn't stay a local disagreement for long. Mississippi's governor, Tate Reeves, went further than the DA did, saying publicly that Crump and Sharpton are stoking division for personal gain, and placing blame on them directly for threats that have been made against people connected to the case. It's worth being precise about what's actually been established here and what hasn't. What's established? The FBI is assisting Jackson County's investigation, and part of that assistance involves looking into interstate threats made against people tied to this case. What hasn't been established, by anyone, is who's actually responsible for causing them. That's Reeves's accusation, not a finding. Crump and Sharpton, for their part, have consistently framed what they're doing as advocacy for a grieving family that felt shut out, not an attempt to stir up anger for its own sake. Both of those things have now been said publicly by people with real power about the same case. Neither has been proven anywhere that matters, and neither is likely to be anytime soon. In the meantime, the practical work continues underneath all of it. The FBI is reviewing digital evidence, including data from Nolan's own phone. His parents have said their concerned messages may have gone missing from it, and Crump's team has agreed to examine that data alongside law enforcement rather than separately. Sharpton, working with NFL Hall of Famer Terrell Owens and filmmaker Tyler Perry, has put up a $125,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. None of it has produced a single public answer to the only question that's mattered from the beginning. Nolan Wells was supposed to go back to football practice the Monday after the 4th of July. Instead, 3 weeks later, his name is attached to a sealed autopsy report, a federal threat investigation, a governor's statement, and a family still standing in front of cameras, asking the same question they asked the first week. What happened to our son? Whatever the grand jury eventually hears, whatever it eventually decides, none of it changes the fact that a mother is still waiting for an answer that was supposed to come from a doctor's report, not a courtroom, 3 weeks after her son went out on a boat and never came home. Part of why this story spread the way it did has nothing to do with any single piece of evidence, and everything to do with where it happened. Mississippi carries a specific weight in American memory. Emmett Till, tortured and killed in 1955 over an accusation at a country store. His killers acquitted by an all-white jury who then sold their confession to a magazine. Medgar Evers, shot in his own driveway in 1963. His murderer walking free for 30 years before a conviction finally came. Christine Wells-Wonsley has said she and her husband had the same hard conversations with Nolan about race growing up in Mississippi that black parents there have had with their kids for generations. That history is why a sheriff's brief comment on the day a body was found landed as hard as it did, and it's why national civil rights figures showed up within a week. None of it is evidence that Nolan's death involved racial violence. Nobody investigating this case has found anything establishing that, and it's fair to hold both things at once. A history that explains why people are watching this closely, and a specific case that still doesn't have a confirmed cause of death of any kind. What gets lost in all of that is the version of Nolan that has nothing to do with any of it. Mississippi state lawmakers adjourned an entire legislative session in his memory. A state representative who'd watched him play football stood up and asked the whole House to pause for a kid he'd only met a couple of times, because that's the impression Nolan left on people, even in passing. His own obituary put it simpler than any headline has managed since. A young man with big dreams and an even bigger personality, whose life was defined by faith, family, compassion, humility, and purpose. Whatever a grand jury eventually hears about how Nolan Wells died, none of it will be the whole story. The whole story is a kid who cooked his mom dinner 3 days before a boat ride, who wanted 3 daughters of his own someday, and who, according to everyone who actually knew him, never once needed a tragedy to be worth paying attention to. We'll be here for the state autopsy, the grand jury, and whatever comes next, and we'll bring it to you the moment any of it is real.